the Enlightenment, Deism, Naturalism, and Science. Refresh your memory by answering these questions from last time. How can we talk about irreligion? What are its modern labels, and why don't they work when talking about the ancient past? What kinds of irreligion can we detect in the ancient subcontinent? What kinds of irreligion can we detect in the ancient Mediterranean? Part 1. Enlightenment. The meaning of reality. Last time, we noticed how difficult it is to clearly label anyone in the pre-modern world as irreligious. While there were certainly groups and individuals who exhibited some forms of atheism, humanism, skepticism, or rationalism, they invariably still seemed quite a bit like religion from our point of view. Certain streams of Indian and Mediterranean cultures could be rationalistic, atheistic, or humanistic, but they were more like religious rationalisms, or religious humanisms, or religious atheisms. And even on the rare occasion when someone appeared to actively reject the reality of a cult or its gods, that is, when someone was actually called a dharmic or atheist, it was in the form of slander. Someone condemned someone else for lacking the proper religious practice or custom. They didn't trust God, or they didn't obey the dharma of things. These were insults, bywords for someone who was troublesome, immoral, or unusual. No one thought that atheism or disbelief was a good thing, and no one identified themselves in that way. And this trend carried on through the centuries, as Mediterranean paganism was gradually replaced by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Atheism was just another way of saying a bad person. And it wasn't until the modern period, the time after the Protestant Reformation in the West, that some people started to call themselves atheists or non-religious. So how did this happen? Well, first, before we get to people who reject religion, we need to have a notion of religion in the first place. Religion, as we understand it, appeared after the Reformation, and its turn to personal belief as the marker of one's Christianity. To be a Christian was to have faith, to hold a certain collection of thoughts in one's mind about God and God's activities, especially in the form of Jesus. God, what was ultimately and most real, was equated with belief, a form of human cognition, thoughts. Personal experiences like mysticism, human societies like churches, or the ethics one practiced, all took a back seat. Thought was the most important feature of post-Reformation Christianity, and the rest was just window dressing. And so we, to this day, still equate religion with personal faith and belief, even though most of the phenomena that we call religion, like Taoism, Confucianism, Hinduism, or Islam, don't historically value your personal thoughts so highly. And so, for those Western Christians who had this Protestant notion of religion, the question presents itself. What does it mean to know something? If knowing certain things was more important than practice, morality, or the community that you belong to, you should probably know what it means to know. This discussion is epistemology, the study of knowing. What does it mean to know something, or to be certain that something that you know is true? Sure, philosophers across history have worked on epistemological questions, from ancient pagan philosophers right through Jewish, Islamic, and medieval Christian history. But after the Reformation, epistemology became much, much more important. After all, to an early modern Christian, you could literally go to hell for thinking the wrong thing. If you start asking yourself about what knowledge is, and whether what you know is true, well, then you have to doubt what you think you know. You have to be skeptical. And not coincidentally, the turn to religion as thought alone, following the Reformation, quickly led to a skeptical turn for many Western Christians too. The most significant of these Christian skeptics was French philosopher René Descartes. Descartes asked himself, what does it mean to know something? And how can he be sure that the thoughts that he held were correct? And so he applied a radical skepticism to himself and his thoughts. To everything in his head, Descartes asked, how do I know that I know this for sure? If I say, it's hot outside, how do I know this for certain? It's possible to feel hot when the temperature is not hot, like when you have a fever. So your sensory data can't always be trusted and known for certain. And if I say, I know my mother's name, it's possible that I'm wrong, because people do misremember things all the time. Maybe I'm senile or insane and I don't know it. So the thoughts called memory can't necessarily be trusted either. People hold all kinds of thoughts that they claim to have experienced or remembered that are wrong. So, what can be known for sure? What thoughts must be true? To this, Descartes concluded, the thought of thought must be real. You can hold any number of false thoughts in your mind, but the thoughts themselves exist, even if they're false. If you think it's hot outside even when it isn't, or you think you remember your mother's name even when you don't, the thoughts themselves still exist. They're real. And if the thoughts are real, the one thinking those thoughts is real too. So even if an evil demon is playing tricks on you and making you think all sorts of things that aren't real, the thoughts themselves must be real, and you, the thinker, must be real. Granted, everything you think you know about the world may be false, and everyone you ever met may be a figment of your imagination, and all of your experiences and memories may be incorrect. But your existence, whatever it is, and your thoughts, even the false ones, must exist. Cogito ergo sum, Descartes concluded. I think, therefore I am. That we exist, and that we're thinking thoughts, is the only thing that we know with absolute certainty. Everything else, history, memory, experience, and even God, must at least be subject to doubt. Descartes and those who followed him applied this kind of skepticism to all the facets of our supposed knowledge about ourselves and the world. Scientific knowledge, political knowledge, historical knowledge, and religious knowledge. This breakthrough in Western epistemology, this turn to skepticism, would later be known as the Age of Enlightenment. Roughly referring to the time between 1650 and 1800, the Enlightenment refers to all the different streams of Western thought which asked challenging questions of human knowledge. Just because something was considered common sense, or traditional, or authoritative, meant nothing at all. All forms of knowledge were open to doubt, no matter how ancient or supposedly obvious. Politically, the Enlightenment would produce thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who rejected anyone's claim to be the rightful ruler of anyone else, most especially the aristocracies and monarchies that ruled Europe since the fall of the Latin Roman Empire. And it was Rousseau and others like him who were skeptical of all inherited or traditional systems of power, and this would give birth to the American and French revolutions in 1776 and 1789. Scientifically, the Enlightenment made Westerners turn to empiricism. Empiricism is the argument that all we know outside of ourselves are data provided by our senses. But because our senses can be duped, or we can misinterpret what we sense, Enlightenment empiricism demands skepticism. We need to not only see or hear things for ourselves, we need to see and hear phenomena many times over in experiments, so we know whether or not we're understanding our senses correctly. Enlightenment, when applied to the arena of material science, was the search for how nature itself worked, and how nature's working could be demonstrated by repeated experiments. This naturalism, the attempt to discover the processes of nature by empirical evidence and replicable experimentation, is what we today call the material sciences. Enlightenment naturalists included figures like Isaac Newton, who tried to demonstrate that the gravitational motion of the heavenly bodies, the invisible force that makes them move in orbits, corresponded with the gravitational motions of terrestrial bodies, the invisible force that makes some objects fall downwards or allows others to fly. And now Descartes and these Enlightenment thinkers that came after him usually still thought of themselves as religious. Descartes was a Catholic, Rousseau was a convert to Calvinism, and Newton was a very pious Anglican theologian. But under their thoughts, we can detect glimmers of irreligion. A Christian can be a skeptic. Part 2. Hierarchy and Equality. If the Enlightenment can be summarized by a single word, it is fact. Originally from the Latin factum, for an action or an observation, Enlightenment thinking started to change that. For the Enlightenment thinkers, a fact wasn't just something that you do or see, but something that was definitively real. Something that's real even when skepticism is applied to it. A fact is something that can be verified by empirical observations and scientific experimentation, but it also exists independent of them. A fact is real whether you know about it or not, or whether you can demonstrate it or not. Roman emperors often wore togas is a fact. Now, you've never seen a Roman emperor yourself, and you've never seen a Roman toga, and you have no first-hand experience of Roman culture and its fashions. But repeated observation of Roman artwork and literature has demonstrated over and over again that Roman emperors often wore togas. And so that's a fact, whether you agree with it or not, whether you like it or not. And even if you don't know what a Roman, an emperor, or a toga even is. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. There's no pre-modern thought like fact. The notion of facts and factuality is as specific to modern Western culture as religion or secularism are. Okay, so then how did ancient people talk about reality? Well, they would just talk about things being the truth. Now today, we have both the notion of fact and the notion of truth, and usually we use them interchangeably. But they aren't exactly the same thing. All facts are true, but not all truths are fact. We can talk about opinions being true, but it's harder to talk about them as facts. If I say, the painting is beautiful, you may agree or not, and if you do agree, we could call that statement true. But it would be difficult to explain how the statement is a fact. We can observe the painting many times and in lots of different ways, but no experiment can demonstrate that the beauty of the painting is a fact. Similar problems would arise from trying to show the factuality of moral truths, whether something is right or wrong, or the reality of experiences, whether what I feel is factual or not, or qualitative truths, like whether or not something is good or not. This distinction between a truth and a fact might seem small on the surface, but when you press it a little, their difference makes all the difference in the world. Let me show you. If you're anywhere in the pre-modern world, you have some notion of reality that more or less acts like our word, truth. So, Brahman is the truth of the gods, or the Buddha Dharma is the truth, or God is the truth, or the Tao is the truth. But truth is also hierarchical. It comes in layers. True, truer, truest. Things can be true in different ways, and true to different degrees. So if you're in ancient India, the texts of the Vedas are true. But the Upanishads, which explains the Vedas, are more true. And the Upanishads refer to the Atman, the eternal self within each of us. And that's even more true than the Upanishads. And the Atman is really Brahman, the transcendent truth of the whole universe. And so, if you're an ancient Hindu, you can believe that the Vedas, the Upanishads, Atman, and Brahman are all true, all in every possible way, but that Brahman is more true than the Vedas. Or let's say you're a medieval Muslim. The material world around you is real. It exists. It's true. And in the material world is the Sunnah of the Prophet, his precedent, which is also by definition true. But Muhammad's Sunnah is more true than, say, a rock. And above the Prophet's Sunnah is the Quran, which is true again. And it's more true than the Sunnah even. And above the Quran is God, who is truth itself. One of God's 99 names is even Al-Haq, the truth. God, the Quran, the Sunnah, and the material world full of rocks are all completely true, but they still fall into a hierarchy: true, truer, truest, and the truth. Or say you're a Catholic in the Middle Ages. Your cosmos would look something like this. You, the common Christian, are true. You exist, you're real. But you aren't as true as, say, the clergy, who know and teach God's will. And the clergy isn't as true as the saints. And the saints aren't as true as God. And you can apply this sort of hierarchical vision of the truth to all sorts of human phenomena: religion, texts, societies, personal opinions. And we still think this way all the time. Whenever you think of something as being more important than something else, or better, or preferable, you're saying that there are multiple things that are true, but one of them is more true than another in some way. But Western modernity, after the Enlightenment, also had this notion of fact alongside this notion of truth. And truth and fact don't always behave the same way. A fact cannot be hierarchical. There's no way to say factor, factist, or factiest. There's just factual. And if it isn't factual, it's either an opinion, a fiction, or a lie. So when you apply facts to hierarchical thinking, reading truth as facts, the hierarchies start to break down. Here's a standard medieval Catholic society. There are peasants ruled by knights, who are ruled by lords, who are ruled by kings, who is sometimes ruled by the Pope. If you try to explain this system after the Enlightenment using facts alone, that is, if you're being skeptical of certain traditional forms of truth, then this system makes no sense. Kings and popes are not factier than the peasants. So hierarchies like this strike the modern mind as a little backwards. Modern politics argues that ideally, everyone is equal. We're all equally factual. Sure, we may elect or appoint certain individuals who function as rulers, But even then, most moderns would feel very uncomfortable with those rulers openly claiming that they're better or more real than their subjects. So, modern politics favors republics or democracies, which ideally, if not always in reality, treat everyone as equally, factually the same, even if it is practical to give some people more power than others. And since the rulers are just facts like you are, if you don't like them, it's your right to reform them or change them, or maybe even kill them. And here's that medieval Catholic view of the universe again. Common Christians, the clergy, the officials of the church, the saints, and God. Well, all people are equally factual, so a priest or even a saint aren't any more real than anyone else is. They're just people. So there's just people and God. And what if you can't even demonstrate through empiricism and experiment that God's even there? Well, then God isn't a fact. So God is either a personal truth, no more factual than the beauty of a painting, a traditional belief, or an overt lie. And so we're stuck with the question: is God a fact or not? Part 3. The wager, the watchmaker, and the temples of reason. So, when the Enlightenment thinkers asked themselves whether or not God was a fact, they came up with a number of possible conclusions. First, you could argue yes, God is a fact, just as humans and pineapples are facts. But unlike pineapples and people, God cannot be known through empirical evidence or experimentation. God is just one of those facts that cannot be demonstrated. Just because something is factual doesn't necessarily mean you have access to that fact. So God can be like that. Since God is beyond the natural world, but the natural world is all that we humans have experience of for ourselves, we can't demonstrate anything beyond nature. We can't demonstrate God. This is referred to as fideism, literally faithism. That is, we should believe that God exists, but know that it's pointless to try and demonstrate God. The most famous proponent of fideism is the French mathematician Blaise Pascal. Pascal, being mathematically oriented, thought of God as a fact in the way that mathematics must assume certain facts that can't be demonstrated, like nothingness, the concept of zero, or the infinite. We cannot have empirical data of nothingness, because everything that we experience is somethingness. And we can't have empirical data of the infinite, because everything that we experience is finite. But we take these axioms of math on faith. Reason suggests that nothingness and the infinite exists, but we can't offer any proofs of their existence. Well, God is like that. God, who is outside of the material laws of nature or our sensory experience, can be suggested, but never demonstrated by experiment. God is a fact which we should accept as an object of rational faith. And Pascal thought accepting faith in a factual God was actually a pretty safe bet. Literally, he thought it was a bet. We refer to this as Pascal's wager. For him, there's only two possible realities. God exists as a fact, or God does not exist. And then there's only two possible choices that we can make. Affirm that God exists, or affirm that God does not exist. So Pascal, ever thinking mathematically, argued that affirming God exists is the only safe bet to make. If God does not exist, and you affirm that God does not exist, you gain nothing. Sure, you're right, but you're not going to be rewarded or punished for correctly supposing a God that doesn't exist. If God does exist, and you deny that he exists, well then that God could punish you for being wrong. He could possibly condemn you to hell for all eternity for failing to believe in him. If God does not exist, and you claim that he does, again, you gain nothing. Well, you were wrong, but because God doesn't exist, there's no price you pay for being wrong. A non-existent God isn't going to reward or punish you because it doesn't exist. But if God does exist, and you affirm that God exists, well then you may gain something, because an existent God could possibly reward you with salvation or heaven. Therefore, Pascal's wager concludes that the only safe bet is to argue that God exists. If you're right, you have everything to gain, and if you're wrong, you have nothing to lose. So, following Pascal's example here, a person living during or after the Enlightenment could speak of God as fact, and still practice Christianity as before. But what about less Christian responses to the problem of whether or not God is a fact? It could be that God is a fact, and that the evidence for that fact is nature itself. That is, that there's some kind of unity of all natural forces and phenomena that escapes human understanding, but it can be noticed through scientific observation. Like Newton seeing a single pattern behind the flight of birds, the falling of apples, and the circling of the stars, and concluding that there could be a single unseen gravitational force causing all of these different phenomena. This could be true for the entirety of existence. Everything that exists in all of its different forms all support a singular pattern. We would call this pattern nature, or natural law. But some Enlightenment thinkers called this God. So this God is factual, but not material. God acts in regular, predictable ways, and we can observe these as nature or natural law. The rules of thermodynamics and mathematics, and physics and biology are singular and regular. And God is that way that humans refer to that regularity that governs all of nature. Enlightenment thinkers called this deism, which literally just means Godism. So, just like a naturalist could look at several different phenomena and perform experiments in order to uncover previously undetected facts about natural law, a theologian could observe natural law and perform thought experiments to uncover the God that made all of nature. Deists often explained their position with the analogy of the watchmaker. Imagine you found an old pocket watch. You look at it, and you notice all sorts of different parts and gears of different sizes and materials that move in several different ways. But even though this watch is composed of many different pieces doing different things, you can detect something singular about the watch. The watch works as a system, and therefore, the watch's regular movements and motions implies a watchmaker, a single mind that planned all of the different parts of the watch in all of their different varieties. The watchmaker controls all of the individual pieces of the system and brings them together in a clever way for some purpose. So, by studying all the different parts of the watch, we can come to know something about the one who made the watch. And to the deists, God is like this. God is the single mind of the whole universe, who designed all of these different elements and chemicals, life forms, and energies, and they move together in a fixed, regular way. Therefore, by studying the natural world around us through empiricism and experiment, we can learn more about the God who designed nature. But if God is like the watchmaker, then deists aren't exactly Christian anymore. And indeed, many deists didn't call themselves Christians. For instance, if God is a fact, and God's actions are observable to us in the regularity of natural law, the deist would conclude that anything that doesn't reflect natural law doesn't reflect God. So miracles are off the table. Jesus could not have risen from the dead bodily, because there's no evidence that nature ever works that way. All empirical evidence shows that dead things stay dead. And the revelation of texts never happens either. God doesn't speak in any factual sense of the word. He has no language or speech organs. So there can be no books that are the word of God. So the Bible becomes quite problematic because it can't reflect God's mind. The God of nature doesn't speak. And besides, the Bible is full of miracles anyway. So the deists had to throw away many of the foundational elements of Christianity: the Bible, the divinity of Christ, and the miraculous. To show you what this ended up looking like, here's the Bible of the most famous of the American deists, Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson liked the Bible, and presumably he considered some of it to be true. But as a deist, he couldn't believe in its claims about miracles, or about God violating the laws of nature. So, Jefferson, being a deist, took out a pair of scissors and just cut out any passage in the Bible that didn't reflect a deist conception of God. No miracles, just the regular, impersonal, indifferent God of nature. But then that leads us back to our question about whether or not God is a fact. If God never speaks, performs miracles, or otherwise interrupts his regular clock-like universe, then what exactly is the difference between God and nature? Because it sounds rather like the deists don't really believe in God. They just believe in natural law. The watch analogy doesn't prove that there's a watchmaker. It just proves that the natural world works mechanically. And so, this is where atheism, as we understand it, comes onto the scene. By the end of the Enlightenment, we can start to notice people who self-identify as atheists. If reality can be explained entirely by facts, empirical observation, and scientific experiment, well then there's no need to hold on to non-factual truths. Facts are all you need, and God isn't a fact. Therefore, God is a fiction. He's just made up. So, for these first true atheists, science alone explained everything. So where does that leave religion then? People all over the world and for nearly all of history held to phenomena that Western Europeans called religion. And those religions could not be true because they're not in accord with facts, with human reason. Therefore, religious people must either be deceived, uninformed, or lying. Reason and reason alone was good for humanity, and anything that denied the power of reason was either ignorance, confusion, or purposefully deceptive. Whatever the case, religion could not be left to continue unchecked by human reason. And so many of the first atheists of the late Enlightenment tried to remove religion from people by argument and sometimes by political force. At the height of the French Revolution, many of the key revolutionary figures who had overthrown the French monarchy held an equal disdain for the Catholic Church, which had supported the monarchy. If the monarchy was evil and built upon lies, well then so was the Catholic Church. Many Catholics met their maker, or not as the case may be, for their religious beliefs as much as for their support of the French monarchy. And in place of the Catholic Church, these revolutionary atheists tried to propagate an anti-religion religion. The cult of reason, as they called it. They held that scientific thought and human freedom were the only ideals. Many French churches were seized in the name of state atheism and renamed temples of reason. Over the doors of Notre Dame Cathedral, the words "to philosophy" were carved. Children were baptized, but not in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, but in the name of LIBERTE, EGALITE, and FRATERNITE, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. There would be festivals and holidays, like the Feast of Reason on November 10th, when famous atheist philosophers, or those believed to have been atheists, were celebrated. Women, in atheist reimaginings of the Virgin Mary, would dress in revolutionary red, white, and blue, and be hailed as goddesses of reason, or, more famously, goddesses of liberty. And depictions of such atheistic goddesses proliferated French art, leading revolutionaries into battle, and, in one case, welcoming immigrants to France's revolutionary sister across the sea. As the Enlightenment's turn to fact replaced the need for monarchs who ruled from on high, revolutionary societies replaced the religion of a god on high with the cult of the nation-state. Civil or civic religion, as we call it now. This was the best means for attaining human welfare, and civil religion, even though it's full of its own cults, customs, morals, and rituals, didn't, strictly speaking, require any transcendent gods. As revolutionaries in the following century would say, ni Dieu, ni maître, no God, no masters. Questions for class discussion. What is the Enlightenment, and how did it come about? What was the big difference between how reality was discussed before and after the Enlightenment? How did Enlightenment thinkers answer the question, is God a fact? What were the results of their answers?